Well, I guess, yeah, let's just get right into it. So my name's Tucker Gibbons. I'm the customer success lead at Continue Mag here. And yeah, really excited to have Rick Haney on the call today to talk about what he's got going on. And yeah, just talk about the Haney Test, talk about some fall soil sampling and some other things too. We can put our contact info in here, at some point in the chat or something. But just if you guys have questions about what we do at Continue Mag, we mainly just help farmers to implement regenerative practices on their farms through two main things. The first is our Regen Roadmap, which is our agronomic advice plan to do these things successfully, field by field, just at it, giving you cover crop plans, other things in that, just the whole operation, basically looking at it today, making recommendations off of that, helping you to do these things successfully. And the other thing is soil sampling. We use the Haney Test on 10-acre zones to really zero in on what's going on out there, really give you an accurate representation of what your plants are going to see in the growing season. And yeah, we're obviously going to talk about that a lot today. So yeah, our guest today is Rick Haney, the legend. I don't really think he needs much of an introduction here. So Rick, thank you very much for coming on today. And yeah, really excited to see what you have to say.
All right. So did you want to just do a question and answer thing, or do you want me to show a little slideshow, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, maybe a little slideshow first if you've got one lined up, and then we can do a little bit more Q&A. I'm sure that a lot of people have some questions for you. So yeah, I think, but a little presentation first, I think would be good.
Let's see what we got. Can you see that?
Yep.
If I can get it there. That picture was taken about 4,000 years ago, right before they invented agriculture. And that the title I came up with a while back because people always ask me, how'd you come up with that test? And I said, well, it was actually a test built for farmers by a farmhand because, I was working on a bunch of farms in Western Oklahoma back in the day. And so that's really where it all started. And so I just kind of wanted to go through this a little bit to where it all started and why it became what it was. And so we want to get right down to the principles, that we live on a plant-based planet that's driven by a star because the sun provides energy and life to everything. And, we sometimes forget these simple, straightforward things. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me. I've seen this stuff before. So, one of the most interesting things I think that has come about in the last 15 years is the cover crop situation where we're really trying to encourage people to do cover crops because if you can imagine all the sunlight that you see when you walk outside, if we can grab that energy and put it in our soil, that's going to make a huge difference in how the soil reacts to your management, how life gets generated. And, to put it another way, carbon seems to be a big deal these days. So, that's actually how we capture carbon. Because when I first started grad school back a long time ago, this is about where we were. We were trying to understand what a dirt molecule was. Now we've come a little bit farther than that. But I found this, in my PhD dissertation, I had a lot of references and I had to fight with the dissertation board at Texas A&M because they said my references were too old. And what was interesting about that was that they weren't too old. They were ahead of us a little bit. And this one guy back in 1892, he figured out pretty much, which is not that long ago, that he considered the soil as a botanist and not a geologist. And that was earth-shattering information for most people. That most people didn't quite understand the difference there. And so, it's not geology, it's biology in the way they work together. So this kind of stuff has been known for a long, long time. We just haven't really dove into trying to understand what we're looking at. This is something this is the title of my last talk at A&M when I got my dissertation. And it was really funny because this was my opening slide and everybody was just looking at me like, what is wrong with you? And the whole idea was about it raining and, what happens when it rains. down here in Texas, we've been dry for 2 months. It hadn't rained for 2 months, and then it started raining, and it rained that one morning, and I walked out into my 2-acre field back here, and by 6 o'clock that evening, the grass had started to green up. Now, if you think about that for a second, it went from dead to green in a matter of hours. And so, how does that happen that quickly? I mean, these things happen fast in the soil, and we're trying to capture some of this information to share it with farmers and ranchers. This is some of the research history. This is the CO2, the little release of CO2 from a dried and re-wetted soil. This is way back in '94. This was such an interesting set of data because the topsoil from College Station was not a very good soil. The one from Amarillo was, and you can see the big difference in spikes where it was just kept continuously moist versus dried and re-wetted. And so there was this big jump in CO2 based on the fertility of the soil, and that was kind of an aha moment. Then we had this test where we took soil and we fumigated it. So you basically killed all the microorganisms. The ones that survived would come back as we put them in an incubator. And what was interesting about this is if you just dried and re-wet a soil, you got a very similar flush to this fumigation process. And so this was another eye-opening thing that was like, wait a minute, these soils are acting like they're alive. And so that was very, very interesting because we had always used this other method before. We didn't ever directly just dry and re-wet soil like happens out in the field and capture the CO2. We didn't think that was a valid measurement. And so then we started looking at this nitrogen, how much nitrogen gets released when it's dry and it rains. And we were seeing this huge correlation between CO2 that was evolved in just a few hours versus a 30-day nitrogen accumulation in the soil. And so that was, again, just mind-blowing, and nobody wanted to believe that it could be this straightforward and this simple. So these were some really strange times back then in 95, 96, because boy, it was almost like we were on some sort of cutting edge thing, and nobody wanted to believe it. And so this is CO2 evolution from the soil from 1 to 6 hours after it had been re-wetted. And we left those samples in an incubator for 30 days. And that was the relationship we got between a few hours and 30 days. And so again, it was just like the soil was talking to us, and we just weren't in a position to understand what we were looking at because it really hadn't been done before. This is my original design. I used IRGA CO2, this is an infrared gas analyzer. And so I was using this to calibrate the Solvita paddle way back when. And that was a really, this is antiquated stuff, but it's come a long way since then. But that was really also very eye-opening. So if you look in the background here, this is our more modern part of the CO2 infrared gas analyzer. It was, we had to develop that because we couldn't afford to buy the paddle. So we had to come up with something different. Yeah, this is what it looked like. This is part of that Western Oklahoma farm boy coming out in me. There's the analyzer. Here's a little off-on switch for the pump and, a couple lines. This is the back side of it. This is where we put a bunch of paddles in jars. And so we were measuring CO2 directly through these jars, then pulling the paddle out and measuring. And what we found was that Solvita did a pretty good job up until a point, and then it kind of started stacking up, and the paddle wasn't sensitive enough to go on up. So here you're looking at 120 to 140 part per million maxed out, and the infrared gas analyzer was running anywhere from 300 to 600. So that made us think, wait a minute, there's more going on here than we thought. So we developed this little analyzer. I built this little thing. I called it the dirt breathalyzer because, that's kind of what we were looking at. And that really blew the door open on a direct measurement of CO2 in a laboratory setting after you dry and re-wet it. Then I went on to build some smaller ones. So these are small versions of this, just to see, because the technology had come so far that, the miniaturization of some of these sensors was really progressive and really good. And so, we were trying to push that envelope on how to measure this stuff. And then the other question was, well, how long do you incubate a soil to get an accurate reading? Well, built this little instrument here, and so we could run 42 samples at a time, and it was all automated, and it did it all by itself. You just programmed it and let it run. And what we found, we were looking for this flush of CO2 that I showed earlier. And what we found was the CO2 in the first day was by far the strongest relationship with the actual peak of CO2. So when you re-wetted dried soil, it starts respiring CO2 and it peaks. And then it starts to come back down, which is kind of a measure of the microbial biomass that was there and available for mineralization. And so we looked at that from 1 to 4 days, and the relationship got looser and looser as we went longer. And so, that's how we established that the 24-hour test was the most accurate. Then we ran across these questions where they were like, well, yeah, but how you know that CO2 is biological, which seemed obvious to us, but they had some of the reviewers had problems with it. We built this little device, and it measured CO2 and O2 uptake. So through the same, it went through 2 sensors, and that was really fascinating. And then here's the result. So this was O2 uptake on the x-axis. So this is O2 that's going away, and this is the CO2 that was released. And you can see they're just highly, highly related. And so that was, we sent that to some folks, and they seem to be more satisfied with that. This is without the really big samples in there, to show that, it's still really a strong relationship. And then recently, I've been messing around with soil respiration in the field. I have a little device I built, and so I can measure CO2 in the ground with a little tube that's stuck in the ground. And to show you the difference, I had all these different sites, and this is before, when it was pretty dry. We got 1.5 inches rain on that field, and look at, everybody jumped up. And this is like a few hours after it had rained. So we used to think it took forever for these microbes to react and really get going, but the reality is it happens really fast. In a matter of minutes, they start really getting to get going. So we can trust these numbers that we get out of the labs, because they're more of a natural process instead of something that we just kind of make up. And this is kind of confusing, but this shows that these little black dots right here, this is every day. We were continuously monitoring the CO2 in the ground. So it would come up and then drop, and come up and drop. And these where it hit these peaks was early in the morning. And that was also really fascinating. So we're having to learn as we go here about how sensitive these systems are and what they really mean. This is another fun one. So we were doing carbon. People were just doing organic matter, or a test called permanganate oxidizable carbon. It doesn't rain permanganate, and so we were using water as an extract, because that's what falls from the sky. And it was really shocking. This was actually where they were using potassium sulfate. We were getting way more carbon out with just water, and that again was eye-opening. So all these soil test methods hadn't really ever taken how nature does things in the field into account. And so our guiding strategy was, if we can figure out how nature's doing this in the field and try to mimic that in the lab, we should get a better picture of what's actually going on. And so instead of just measuring organic matter, we were measuring water extracted organic carbon. We figured out that was the food they were eating. And these 2 graphs kind of show that. So here's soil organic nitrogen and soil organic carbon. You can see it's highly related. But look at the axis. It's 0 to 5,000 part per million for nitrogen, and 0 to 50,000 for carbon. That's a giant pool of carbon and nitrogen. These are the same soils that we did a water extract on and did organic nitrogen. And organic carbon. See this 0 to 1200, 0 to about 100. This right here is the nitrogen we have not been accounting for when we do standard soil tests. This is really important to farmers and ranchers because this is a storehouse of nitrogen that we have not been accounting for with our soil test methods that's there and available and being acted upon by microorganisms. So, this is part per million. So that, that's 40 pounds, that's 80 pounds, 160 pounds. That's a lot of nitrogen that's floating around out there. And so we wanted to try to, start doing this different, thinking about it different. Instead of, the way we've been doing it is not necessarily the way nature does it. So we wanted to, we really got into the cover crop thing. Now I'm going to go through some of these a little fast. So in my talks, I've been asking people, how many of you are carrying these in your pocket? Because, we're carrying these because, this to me are the old soil test methods and these are the newer ones. So, it's the 21st century, and I think it's time to shift our thinking about how we look at soil and seeing it as a living entity instead of, something that's just inert. So we're at one of those great moments in evolution where we need to really understand how our farming systems are impacted by our management and try to think a little bit different about how to do this. It's a phrase that I coined many years ago, plants fix dirt, make soil, because I think the fastest way to build good soil is with plants. And, that's the model that's been set on this world for many, many years. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Let's just move on. This is my water infiltration slide, my test. I was running this tractor, rolling down some cover crops, and I infiltrated that tractor really well into that field right there. That's a great test for water infiltration. I'm going to move a little bit quicker here on some of this. This is the dead zone of the Gulf 2019, 8,500 square miles. We could do better than this. This is just not acceptable for our fertilizer use efficiency. We've just got to do better than that. And these newer tests are trying to help push that in the right direction. This is one of my favorite little slides. Hey, wait, we don't have to be just sheep. We can get out of our comfort zone and try to do something a little bit different. That guy right there, that reminds me of Ray Archuleta every time I see this slide. So what we're trying to do here is mimic how the soil responds after rainfall in the field. That's what that test, the Haney test, was developed to do, not how it responds to 30 to 60-year-old lab methods. We want to understand what's happening in your soil when you send that sample in out in the field, and not necessarily what we can make it do in the lab. Some of the new stuff that we're working on, I'm going to move this along so that we can get time to talk. Part of the soil extractant that I developed, and this was very eye-opening for me because I was manipulating pH of the soil extract. And so that's the pH. These are a bunch of different soils. And this is the pH after they're extracted. And this is the extractable P. So at very low pH, we extracted an enormous amount of phosphorus out of that soil. And these are all the same soil. So we were moving that. So when the pH of the extract got really high, we weren't getting very much. And so this was very eye-opening to me. So, because we have soil extractants in labs that were very acidic or very alkaline, that would be here, and we didn't have anything in between. And that's why I developed the naturally occurring organic acids to look at what was actually being extracted in the field, in your field, at your pH. So that was an important piece of the puzzle too. So now we're starting to see some phosphorus in the middle of this pH deal instead of just on one end or on the other end. This is just more data. This is the evolution of the extract. It got better and better. It got closer. And this is kind of the standard for phosphate testing in laboratories. It's called iron aluminum oxide strips. And we got closer and closer to a one-to-one relationship. right, which is what it ended up being right there. So that was it. It took about 5 years to evolve that test to get it to where it needed to be. And then once we got it, we felt pretty confident about it. We also added this phosphorus mineralization potential in the equations, because we weren't just looking at what was extractable right now. We were trying to see what was going to be available in the future. We also do that with nitrogen. So there's some predictive qualities, both N and P, in this test. And this is from Continuum Ag. I don't know who that bunch is, but they came out with some really good information that you can talk to them about. This was a game changer. This instrument right here was a carbon nitrogen analyzer for water samples. This is what really made things change, because then I could see, the organic nitrogen pool that we've been missing all those years because of the addition of this instrument. I think we got one of these in about 2005, maybe, or 4, something like that. And that was a big moment for me to incorporate this data, because, and I looked at some sample analysis from a friend that sent me some the other day, and he was like, well, I don't have any nitrogen. They said I need 100 pounds, and all they tested for was nitrate nitrogen. He had 18 pounds of that. And so they just assumed that none of the rest of this stuff exists in soil. These are all organic nitrogen compounds that are floating around in your soil, and we're not accounting for them with the standard tests, and we are accounting for them with the Haney test. So we've been missing about half the nitrogen for a long, long time that's actually available, as opposed to, the way we've been doing it. This is a quick little deal so you get a soil health calculation. This is dollars of nitrogen saved per acre. And so if you take your soil health calculation times 2.42, that'll give you a rough idea of the nitrogen fertilizer you can save on any given soil. Cover crops. Yep. I'm going to move along here on some of this. That's a root system. I mean, this is a complex system that we're only now beginning to understand that the game is where the root and the soil interact. That's where all the microbes are. That's where everything is happening. And that's just, really something we need to get into better. I'm going to move on from some of this. If you guys have any questions, I can show you some of the stuff I've been doing with Lance. This is the fungal bacterial ratio from PLFA. And if you look here, he says about 0.25 or so is a really good fungal to bacterial ratio. This is functional group diversity. They are highly related, which is really interesting. It's neat when these tests actually show you something that you hadn't seen. So there's an interaction here that's very important. Lance tells me this functional group diversity is really important, and you can see when we get these fungal to bacterial ratios up, that functional group diversity starts. This is an interesting one. This is inorganic nitrogen, which would be nitrate ammonium, and this is protozoa, PLFA. And as you can see, there are no when the inorganic nitrogen gets high, there's really no protozoa. And as the nitrogen comes down, the protozoa show up. So that's another little living indicator of what they think of the synthetic fertilizer versus it's much more diverse with this water extractable organic nitrogen. We see a lot more of it showing up with the protozoa. So that's kind of an interesting thing that popped out. This is the soil health calculation. Functional group diversity is good, 1.3 to 1.5. And as you can see, that's where soil health calculations is clustering also. So both of these tests are trying to give us a different insight into what's happening in your soil, and they seem to be jiving pretty good. This is soil respiration. And as your functional group diversity increases, your respiration tends to increase. And he says, 1.45 to 1.5, and right, there's all your respiration. That's where it all comes in right there. So balance. So as we've always spoken about, balance is what nature's seeking, and these results tend to show us that. again, fungal to bacterial ratio about 2.5, and there it is. So again, balance is what nature's trying to seek, and these tests are helping us understand where we're at. This is gram positive to gram negative. 2 is supposed to be, balanced. And again, there's the respiration. Same for carbon. This is a good one. Liz and I started a boneless chicken ranch, and it didn't work out very well. So they were hard to herd them. Now, to get on, I'm almost done. Just hang in here with me. This is field versus fence. It's something I did years ago at work. We were having farmers, everybody wanted to know if they were doing good, if their regenerative practices or whatever they were trying to do was helping or hurting their soil. So we had them start taking samples from their field and then go to the fence row and take samples out of their fence row and send both samples in. So this is in Oklahoma. The fence was better than the field. This is a native range in Texas and a field right next to it. And look at the massive difference between those two. So that's the effect of management on the natural system. This is Pennsylvania and Iowa. And so that was very eye-opening. And so instead of having to compare your management practices to your neighbor, we were having you compare your management practices to your soil. And so that was a different way to think about it. And a lot of folks really found that very interesting. So now we have a new set of calculations that is a depth analysis. And so we're taking 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 inch samples separate from the same hole and compositing them and sending them in. And from that information, we run calculations between those two depths to see how you're doing. Because your 0 to 6 is your management zone, and your 6 to 12 is kind of your baseline. So we can get a real good look at how your management is impacting what the status of your soil as far as fertility and nutrient cycling and all that. And so we get these really cool scores. And we can also use the solid, liquid, and gas phase of carbon for what's being captured, what's being sequestered between those two depths. That is also really interesting. And this calculation will be offered in the future at Regen Ag Labs at some point. We also have a water quality index. So this is basically what's happening in your field as far as what runs through your field and what runs off your field. And so we have some calculations on how it's going to impact water quality for nitrogen and or phosphorus. You can get this information from a 0 to 6 Haney test. We have another one called the nutrient density index. So this would be the organic nutrient density index, also from a 0 to 6 Haney test. As you can, so we're going to index this out to see, because there's been a lot of talk about nutrient density in foods. And we believe that if you're going to have nutrient density food, you're going to need a nutrient dense soil. And so we have a measurement for that, and so that we can index you and show you where your soil falls on that scale. This is another calculation. So if you run PLFA, I've come up with a PLFA soil health score, basically like the Haney Test soil health score. So this is just showing you, this is the average living microbial biomass for PLFA, and this would be the PLFA horse health score. So it's kind of a combination of several measurements that lean a little bit towards the fungal bacterial ratio. And so now we're going to be able to show you, instead of just looking at total living microbial biomass, we're going to get to show you what the quality of it is. And so this will be a fun little addition to the PLFA test. So anyway, that's about all I've got. The last thing I think I'll show you is there's been a lot about talk about plant-based meat, and I think that this plant-based meat is really going to take off. I showed this in various places, and people don't really realize that, beef and bison, those are plant-based meats. So we're getting a little carried away with some of this, plant-based plant stuff. So anyway, that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, so we can move into some Q&A here. We've got some questions in the chat already that we can get to, but feel free to unmute yourself as well if you've got a question. But yeah, first we'll start. Bob had a question here. Any different outcomes between rain-fed fields versus irrigated fields with the Haney test?
Yeah, we've seen more of the salt effect under irrigated land. Of course, that depends on the quality of the water. In some of those places, there's a lot more salt effect. It's not dramatic, and it also depends tremendously whether those irrigated fields have got cover crops in their rotation somewhere. It makes a huge difference as far as being better for nutrients and cycling and all that. One of the really interesting things that we were out in Arkansas this summer at Adam Chappell's place, and he doesn't flood irrigate his rice. He dries it. He lets it dry and re-wets it, lets it dry and re-wets it. And he said that he uses less water and gets better yield by doing that. And that's really kind of following nature's way nature does it. So he's seeing really good results and using less water and still getting good yield. So that's really some interesting stuff.
Another question from Tom here. Can you talk about cover crops and if you select different ones for moving from corn to beans or beans to wheat to corn, basically just the next crops that you're going to? Do you change that recommendation at all?
Well, yeah, I would. The fun part about this is that if you run your samples, you pull your samples before you put fertilizer out. If you've had cover crops in that or not have cover crops in that or whatever, your soil should give us some indication of, for what you did with the cover crops worked or not. So if we're seeing low organic nitrogen, then we're going to have a few more legumes in the mix, as opposed to if you have quite a bit of organic nitrogen, then we're going to lean toward grasses a little bit more. Because again, we're trying to balance that system as best we can based on the nutrient levels and the microbial activity that we're seeing and the carbon availability and all of that. So we can get most of that information from the soil test to help change the cover crop mix if necessary.
You ever do water extractable C to N ratio on subsoils?
Yeah, we do. When you say subsoil, we've looked at a lot of 6 to 12, some 12 to 18, 18 to 24. And it's really interesting because the C to N ratio doesn't change all that dramatically as you go down to 24 inches. But what does change, and this is where ratios get tricky sometimes, because you can have a 10 or 12 to 1 ratio all the way down that profile. But of course, your numbers are changing dramatically. So you've got a lot less carbon, a lot less nitrogen, but the C to N ratio stays pretty standard. Yep.
All right, here's another one from Tom. It'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on this and if you've seen anything here, but any effect with Roundup on soil microbes and the chemistry of the soil?
Oh yeah. So when I was in graduate school, the whole thing about Roundup came out, and everybody was mad, suing Monsanto. And so we did a bunch of studies, and what we found, we looked through the literature first because we wanted to know what was the effect on microbial activity of Roundup. So the Roundup that hit the soil, what happened? Well, the problem was all the papers that had been written, they had sprayed Roundup on soil that didn't have, it just had weeds, so-called weeds in it. They weren't very tall. They sprayed, so a lot of the Roundup hit the soil. They'd wait a month and go out there and take a 6-inch soil sample and run an analysis to see if that Roundup had done anything. Well, they couldn't find any Roundup, didn't affect the microorganisms. They said no effect. Well, the problem is when you spray Roundup on something, it penetrates about 2 millimeters into the soil. So you got a 2 millimeter penetration of Roundup, and then you come back a month later and take a 6-inch soil sample. So you diluted the effect tremendously. So that's why they weren't seeing anything. So we made adjustments to our calculations and tried to look at what was actually impacting the soil by depth and saw a huge response. Interesting part about that was we looked at analytical grade Roundup, which had no surfactant, and then we looked at off-the-shelf Roundup. The off-the-shelf Roundup knocked the microbes back in the first 24 hours, pretty hard, below the control. But the analytical grade just blew up way beyond the controls, because so it was the surfactant that was knocking the microbes back. And we published several papers on that, but I don't know, I don't get into does Roundup cause cancer? I don't know. I don't have any idea, but I can tell you that if we use too much of anything over and over and over and over, we might end up with a problem. But as far as Roundup and microbial activity, we did several studies where we tank mixed it with atrazine, and then we tracked the Roundup and atrazine's fate in the soil. And the microbes took the Roundup out in 2 weeks, and then in 56 days, it had taken most of the atrazine. So that was a priming effect, and we saw a lot of changes in those soils. Now, here's the question, though, is, if Roundup knocks these microorganisms back, do the same ones come back? Or who is somebody different coming back? What niche gets filled when something gets removed? And we don't really have those answers.
Next question is from Ben here. Are you aware of any labs in the eastern U.S., particularly in the southeast, that reliably perform the Haney test? Or do you recommend shipping samples to Regen Ag Lab?
Yeah, I highly recommend sending to Regen Ag Lab. Lance has been faithful from the beginning. When he was at Ward and when he started his own lab, he's been in constant contact with me. We've always stayed in contact, and now I'm working with him. And so, yeah, and I am not aware, honestly, of any labs in the southeast that are doing this test. We're doing it.
Okay, we've got a question on timing for collecting samples here. I guess, yeah, best time to collect a fall soil sample.
So are we talking about fall soil sample for spring fertilizer application is my question.
I think so. Yeah, this is from Jim here. So yeah, I guess for making recommendations for the spring planting season, best time to take it if you're going to do it in the fall.
Before the soil gets too cold would be my answer. And when I say too cold, I mean, not below 50 degrees, maybe something like that. Because that way, excuse me, we can see kind of what is going on. You don't want to take it right after harvest because you got a depletion of nutrients, you got a depletion of carbon. All these things are in kind of a depleted state, and we want them to recover a little bit before it gets too cold. If that's even an answer.
I think that makes sense. Next one here, we got quite a few. Hopefully we can get to all of them, but next one is so Liz Garst put on a soil health easement on her land, practice-based, not test-based. What series of tests would you recommend over time to measure upward movement of soil health?
Well, this is going to be biased. And by the way, that's a fun thing. I grew up in Coon Rapids, Iowa, and where the Garst family is, and we knew those people. That was just, I saw that she had sold some of that, and that was just really interesting. That took me way back. But anyway, this depth analysis I think is really, really interesting. The 0 to 6, 6 to 12, as we can really see the effect of your management as opposed to just a 0 to 6 sample. By comparing those two depths, that really nails down where you're at your regenerative agriculture journey, and I would highly recommend doing some of those tests, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, because we can look at carbon, we can look at how your regenerative journey is going along. We have a big data set of that information now, and so we can score that. And the fun part is you're scoring your soil against yourself. It's not against your neighbor or somebody in New Mexico or anything like that. It's your field against your management. And that is really insightful.
Terry's got one here. And again, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself and butt in here. But yeah, Terry's got a question. Are there long-term detrimental effects of soil health from a drought year, or does it just slow down the positives?
Well, that's a well put question. And my answer to that is, right here in my backyard, this 2-acre little native range land. I mean, everything died. 2 months of no rain and 100 plus temperatures. And when you walked across there, it's like Rice Krispies, just everything was just crispy and dead. And I will guarantee you that once it rained, when the water goes away, if you have let's call it X soil health, and the water goes away, everything stops. And so when it rains, it revs back up. So are you going to be able to grow a crop during that? No. I mean, water's the key again, but your soil health is not going to go away. The only way you can really wipe out soil health is through poor management practice, in my opinion. And I'll give you a quick example. A friend of mine in Pennsylvania knew this guy, and they had cleared out some trees on the side of this mountain for some deer food plots. The organic matter level, where before they cleared that place, was like 14% organic matter. A year after they had cleared it and sampled it again, now they pulled the stumps out and mulched the whole thing. Organic matter was 4.5%. So it went from 14 to 4.5 in 1 year because of management. And so that's a really interesting thing to see. So if we have drought, your soil health is not going to degrade based on that, because it will rain again some. It system shuts down. That's why we dry the samples before we run the Haney test on it, because we want everybody on the same playground as far as moisture content, and then we rev them back up and see what happens.
Okay, question from Brian here. You showed the slide that correlates nitrogen to soil health score. Do you have anything that correlates P and K or other nutrients to soil health?
Yeah, the tricky part about P and K is that, we don't know. If you add fertilizer, we can tell if you have fertilizer usually. And so when you add fertilizer, you artificially move that number. And that nitrogen number was the organic fraction that we're accounting for. So we can see the organic phosphorus. Yes, and I just looked at some of that before we got on this morning. And yes, we can see the organic phosphorus, but potassium, we don't have a test for organic potassium. So potassium is more tricky. So when we look at this information and we look at soil health versus NPK levels, we have to be able to separate out the organic fractions from the inorganic, because you can just add fertilizer and jack your P and K up, which is not a biological system. So it's very difficult to see those kind of numbers for P and K, because we can artificially move. You can with nitrogen too, but we have tests that separate out for organic nitrogen and organic phosphorus. We don't have one for organic potassium.
Question from Jay. How soon after harvest is the best time to sample when you're looking for baseline carbon?
Baseline carbon, that's a good one. That probably anytime you can. Sometimes you harvest it super dry or kind of wet, or whatever you could get in there and do it'll be fine. Carbon's going to be a deal in the future, as everybody knows, and this depth analysis that we're using for carbon capture is really eye-opening and very interesting. And I think before anybody jumps off into carbon markets, you might want to try a little bit of this to see kind of where you're at. Right now, most everybody's using just organic matter or total organic carbon, and that's kind of missing the part of the game, because if you think about the sunlight and plants capturing CO2, you've got gas and liquid phase carbon there that are very important for us to understand how they're working in a certain soil. And if we omit that, I'm not sure what we're kind of carbon we're looking at, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so we're looking for, we actually do a soil organic carbon test and a Haney test, which I think also includes the SOC, doesn't it? And bulk density. So that's what we're doing to try to find out what our baseline carbon is, so that we can measure how much carbon we're sequestering.
Yeah, and again, that depth analysis is what really nails that home nice. So you might consider doing a few of those time to time.
Okay, thank you.
Got a question from John here. Is soil from different regions tested and reported in the same way?
Yes, it is. And that's the other thing. I think Tucker and I and Mitch and Liz and much of us have talked about that. We have these old soil test methods that are calibrated to the tri-state area or whatever, and that's fine and dandy. But we have the technology today to calibrate to your field. We have the soil testing methods and the information that we could actually start calibrating to a farmer's field instead of trying to hit the tri-state area, because not all soils are the same, and surely not all climates are the same. So we have a lot of work to do on that.
Okay, we've got one here. Besides nitrogen and soil respiration, how do Haney tests vary from using standard M3 or paste tests? Do you have parts per million targets for the secondary and trace elements?
No, we don't do what we're looking for with the Haney test for micronutrients, NPK. We're looking for that NP and K that is being given up by the soil naturally. In other words, we're trying to, if you were to set up a research plot, you had you were growing corn and you had a plot where you had no nitrogen fertilizer, and then 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 300 pounds. We're looking for what you're getting out of that control plot. That's the biggest difference between the standard test and our test. We're trying to account for what nature's giving you for free before you add anything, if that makes any sense. That's what we're really after. We're not looking for fertilizer response curves. That's been done to death. What we're looking for is the nitrogen that fertilizer response curves miss. So that's what the Haney test is trying, because we're doing standard, the same, we're doing nitrate, nitrogen, and ammonium. Malic 3 phosphate versus H3A phosphate is going to be about 1.5 times higher, because malic is so much more acidic and highly buffered that it pulls out more phosphate that isn't necessarily available. And so the Haney test phosphorus is trying to look more at what's actually there and what a plant root's going to see, as opposed to what we can pull out in the laboratory with very acidic craft.
Question from Todd here. So are all microbes or biology you need in soil always there, or are there circumstances like flooding or freezing that require you to put some in through adding products? And if there are those products, or if you need to add those products, does the Haney test make that information available?
No, the Haney test looks at respiration as a holistic group. It does not separate out certain species or fungal or bacterial. That's it. It just, the CO2 respiration is how the whole community is reacting. So no, it's not that specific. And does it change? Yes. And what we're discovering through some of this DNA analysis and PLFA is that different groups show up when different environmental conditions present themselves. And microbes, they fill niches. They're there, and then when they run out of whatever their job is, they're gone for a while, and then they'll come back. So environment, the plants especially, I'm a firm believer that the plants farm the microbes, and they attract who they need when they want to by through their roots and the chemicals and carbon compounds they drop out their roots. So it's an ever changing system. Now, if you're a monoculture wheat farmer that's never grown anything but wheat, your wheat has farmed for a certain set of microorganisms, opposed to a field that would be rich in diversity. There's going to be a very different set of microorganisms there. That will show up in the respiration. You'll see higher respiration with more diversity, which is, I tried to show some of those graphs, but it depends on your management style and what you're doing. But yeah, it'll change depending on all those factors. But the Haney test is not designed to look at individual species.
We got time for a couple more questions here. That was all the questions in the chat, but again, feel free to unmute yourself. One question that I have is about the real-time CO2 sensor. You mentioned that a little bit in your presentation. Where do you think the future of that is? Like, do you think we'll get to the point where farmers have those on their farms and they can link it to their fertilizer spreaders and basically adjust based off of what the real-time CO2 sensor is telling it, or where do you think that's going to go?
Oh, I do believe that down the road that in-field sensing is going to be huge. The question is, are we going to do it? Are we going to track the right things? In other words, if we're just going to stick to the NPK mentality, and that's it, I don't know that we're going to really move things forward that well. But if we start looking at the biological aspects of how your soil's reacting to your management, then I think we'll be able to make better decisions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to use CO2 respiration to apply fertilizer correctly, but I do think it's going to give us an overall picture of our management strategies and how they're impacting what we're doing, and that maybe we can, be more efficient with our nutrient use in the future. I think I see them as a way to do that. See some of the DNA stuff that they're doing where they're looking at different like phosphorus pathways, nitrogen pathways being open or closed, and whether or not going to need to have more or less fertilizer based on that. I see that as a possibility in the future. But fast as things are moving, who knows what the future is.
Another question from Todd here. What are you seeing the best producers do with your information, making cover crop decisions or using less synthetic fertilizer? Do you recommend a 100% reduction of synthetics based on the percentage of organic availability that your test shows?
I don't ever recommend 100% reduction of synthetics because I'm a proponent of, let's say you have 100 acres that you want to try something different on. You want to start growing cover crops on it, and that you haven't been, and pick out 10 acres and let your farm show you what it's on to you. Let it tell you what it's after, because when we get a system used to, we put this much fertilizer down, we do this kind of plowing, we do this or that or other, you kind of set that system into a place. And when you start changing it, a whole lot of factors come into play there. And everybody's heard of the yield drag. Well, there's a yield drag because the system's disrupted, for better or worse, from both angles. And so I would move into that kind of baby steps. Now, I had this conversation with somebody a while back, and I said, good and well that we could back off nitrogen fertilizer in this country by 20% across the board and not see a yield drop. And they were like, yeah, I know. Well, part of this reason this test is in existence is because it kind of showed you that it, that we are over fertilizing, and we can, cut back. Eventually, I think you can get down pretty low, but we're so used to high yields. Our yields are beyond what the soil can naturally give, and because we're pushing for such high yields. So you're going to have to supplement with something to maintain that. The biggest, scariest thing all the farmers I work for had is if they cut back on an input and their yield fell, they were devastated. Now they might have made more money, but they didn't get over the emotional loss of the yield loss, so it really boils down to what's your net income here, not your yield.
Kind of in that same thought here, a lot of times when I'm talking to farmers, they bring up the thought that you're mining the soil if you don't add more nutrients every year. So you say, yeah, if you cut back 30% on inputs across the board, there will be no yield drop across the country. But their argument is, well, we're mining all that out of the soil. How do you address people who say that and have that mentality?
That's why Lance offers that total nutrient digest, Regen Ag Labs, because that is and I have a whole file full of same soil that had the Haney Test run on it, had a total nutrient digest on it. And one of the other things I'm looking into doing is that, because as Lance explains it, that total nutrient digest shows your NPK levels and your micronutrients that you have in the bank. And the Haney Test is showing you what's in your checking account. And so, it's your savings account versus your checking account. We hear that a lot. Oh, we're mining the soil. Well, let's say you cut back 50 pounds on your nitrogen and you look at your total nutrient digest and there's, 3,000 pounds of nitrogen in that soil per acre. You're not mining it. Not, we're not going to affect that much. The idea is that there's these big pools of nutrients in your soil, and we want to enhance the microbial activity and the carbon to get at that, to let the microbes, allow the microbes to go after that stuff and start nutrient cycling like they're used to. Because when we throw synthetic fertilizer out there, we interrupt the nutrient cycling system. And so there's going to have to be a balance between those two. So as we back off on our fertility, we have to give time to allow the nutrient cycling to start coming around to fill that void.
Awesome. Well, hey, we're coming up to our time here. So Rick, thank you very much for hopping on here and answering all these questions. It was great. I think a lot of good information here. I think we have this recorded, so we will be able to send it to you guys if you want it. And thanks everyone for hopping on. This is great.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks.